Intra-Africa trade, we have to understand, is coming from a very low level currently. We are trading amongst ourselves at currently 12%, rising of course, but we are at a very low level compared to regions like Europe, which are trading at 60%. So we need to trade more amongst ourselves. The biggest advantage is that research has shown that trading amongst ourselves tends to be much more diversified than trading with external markets. And it tends to be much more resilient to external forces. We saw that during the financial crisis of 2008, intra-Africa trade or regional trade within Africa was much more resilient because it was not influenced by the external forces and external volatilities. The starting point for intra-Africa trade enhancement is obviously to have regional agreements across the continent that will bring our markets closer. Now, you begin that by having, of course, regional trade agreements, and we have these, but the implementation has to be followed up effectively. But with that, we need to have trade facilitation arrangements across the continent that will facilitate connectivity of the markets. There's no need to just have agreements when between two countries there are no roads, there's no rail connectivity to move products. So therefore there's need to have these trade facilitation arrangements. This brings me to the fact that we have now a global agreement called the Trade Facilitation Agreement of the World Trade Organization. If implemented effectively by African countries and comes into force at the World Trade Organization, this will facilitate these sort of projects across the continent. Currently, as you know, most of Africa's transport costs are very high, amounting to maybe 40% of products. That is very high compared to other regions of the world, and reducing that will require proper infrastructure in terms of railroad, customs facilities, and so forth. Currently, Africa's leading trading partner is still Europe. It continues to lead. But in 2008, China surpassed the US in terms of being Africa's destination for exports or trading partner. So Europe is first, then China, and of course the US follows that. So this is the trend. But of course, the trend also shows that Africa is increasingly trading with the emerging economies, China leading, and then Brazil, India, and Russia, and so forth, the BRICS in short. These emerging economies are continuously becoming significant for Africa's market. The CFTA is supposed to be a continental-wide free trade agreement. It is supposed to be launched, it's supposed to be concluded next year. It is a very ambitious program, but one that is necessary, no doubt, because once concluded, it is estimated that if it's concluded effectively and implemented, it may increase inter-Africa trade by almost 52% by 2022 if implemented according to the program. So it is an essential vehicle for increasing intra-Africa trade. You know, Africa's potential is huge. The industrial potential is enormous. What we need to do as Africans is to translate that potential into reality. We have long talked about the potential, but that will require certain reforms taking place within the countries, African countries, but also at the regional level. It will require attending to our environment to attract investment that will be able to bring industrialization on the continent. One of these factors is say labor, energy, resources. As you know, we have quite a deficit on the continent in terms of power, for instance. Those things need to be attended to, infrastructure issues, so that the environment is conducive enough to attract this sort of investment. I was earlier talking about the positioning of Africa in terms of industrial outflow that will come out of China, because China's labor cost is rising as the middle class increases in China, and therefore Africa can place itself competitively to attract this investment from China. In some respects, yes, but what I may say about that is that while China has a strategy for Africa, Africa doesn't seem to have a strategy for China on how to engage with China. There are a few things that can be adjusted in order to take full advantage of our engagement with China as Africa. For instance, the sort of projects that you are seeing across the continent being undertaken by the Chinese, we need to see benefits out of that. I mean, it's not just the delivery of the product, but we want to see that there is more Africans employed in those projects, for instance, that the receivables are taking effect they are taking effect across the economy. The other things that we could do as Africa, for instance, China is involved in a lot of extractive industry across the continent. But if we had a strategy to say, some value must be added before those products are exported, instead of just exporting raw materials, that can enhance our industrialization. If, for instance, they mine copper, why don't we tell them, look, instead of exporting cathodes, you produce wire and export wire. Then that will bring about industrialization. But we need to have a strategy as Africans ourselves on how we're engaging with China. Unfortunately, we are dealing with one country which has a strategy, but Africa is many countries, 54 countries, and they tend to have individual national strategies on the priorities that they have. So when you have the China-Africa Forum, it tends to be very fragmented approach. Each country goes and receives the sort of benefits from China that they wish to see. I think that once we have regional agreements, continental-wide agreements, that can then engage at that level with China with priority projects that we want across the continent. That will be the way forward. 10 of the fastest growing economies globally, 6 of them are African countries. So we have growth here, except that the challenge is that that growth is not effectively translated into poverty reduction. That is the biggest challenge. How do we distribute this growth that we are seeing? But in terms of the future, I see that many countries are talking about entering into the value chains, which means you need to have some sort of manufacturing capacity, and that will be essential because we can't just continue producing raw materials and exporting this. Firstly, we are basically exporting jobs to other countries, and it is much more cost effective for our investors to come closer to the source of raw materials than to move the raw materials to wherever they're manufacturing. So there's economic sense for the future for industries to come closer to the raw materials, which is in Africa.